Okay, as folks are continuing to come in, welcome to Race More Than Just Talk. Today, it's about exploring white privilege. We are live streaming on Zoom and on YouTube Live, so welcome to everyone. I'm Lenora Billings-Harris, the host of More Than Just Talk. Jen Marshall and Patrice Bernard will be helping us navigate questions. So please do send your questions in. There's a Q&A button if you're on Zoom. And I believe there's also a chat or a comment button if you're on YouTube. So we'll be watching both of those. Thank you so much for those of you who registered ahead on Zoom, because we have so many questions that you sent ahead of time. We are going to try very hard to get to all of those questions. So let's get right to it. I know we're going to need every moment. My guest today is Corey Kupfer. He is an attorney, a professional speaker, a consultant, and a coach on the topic of visionary leadership. However, he's here today because of his work that he has been doing with Raw Goddess, together called White Awakening, which is designed to help white people who aspire to create a more just and sustainable world to move beyond the limiting postures of simple allyship and into the deeper realm of full rehumanization. Corey and Ra have been doing this work for years, so I knew having him as our guest today would be the perfect person to talk about white privilege. Welcome, Corey.
It's so great to be with you and everybody else.
Well, thank you. I'm just so excited for today and to hear you talk about this subject. My clients and participants constantly ask me questions about this topic, and I think it's so appropriate that you've been doing this work. It's not something that was new for you. You know, lots of people just started last year with doing some of this work. So my first question to you is, given that you have a career in a couple of different areas, what brought you to this work?
You know, it's interesting for me. I started my own law firm when I was 30 years old, and within a few years had some level of success, and got to the point where I think more people usually, maybe they're in their 50s or whatever, where it's sort of like, yeah, this is great, but is this all my life's about? Right? Like I got to the point pretty early in my 30s where I was like, I need more meaning. That led me to look at what I was passionate about creating. I did some personal growth work and all this kind of stuff. And really, what I realized is that what I'm here to do is to bring people together across perceived differences so that we realize we're all one. I always had this fundamental, I don't even, from when I was little, this just inability or difficulty in understanding why we were so separated and there was so much, tension and conflict. And that led me to, I won't go into it's a long story, but that led me to get involved with the Hunger Project and spend some time in Ghana and Uganda and India in villages and really redefine myself as a world citizen and really get connected to the fact that I believe that on a fundamental human basis, we all want the same things, right? When you're in a village, and you see folks who are trying to end their own hunger and being empowered to end their own hunger because the Hunger Project didn't give any food to anybody, what they care about is being able to feed their kids, being able to educate their kids if they live in a place where that's possible, having the next generation have a better life than they did, like these common values that we have around the world. And then that led me to, not long after that, back in 2000, to create something called the Conversations About Race Project. And it wasn't really like I was still learning about race and privilege and things like that, but my motivator always came to, in terms of bringing people together and connecting people. Mm-hmm. And, so I can tell you more about the project, but it was effectively bringing people together for one-on-one conversations about race. And then when I started looking into the question of what has us not be connected, right, and what keeps us divided, that's when I started learning about privilege.
Got it. So it was a journey for you to get to this place. Well, since we're we're going to be using a couple of terms and we want to have a baseline. I'm going to start by asking you a question about two terms, the first of which is white privilege. So what is it exactly?
Yeah. So I think we got, and this is going to be important in some of the things we're going to talk about later, right? There's a reason why there's two words there, white and privilege, right? So, let's start with privilege. That's easy, right? Privilege is where somebody has some advantage, some given advantage in some way because of some factor over somebody else, right? And that could be caused by many things. The reason why we say white privilege is because there are other types of privileges, right, that people can have. In this area, there's gender privilege, right? There's being straight versus being gay, right? So there's cisgender versus non-cisgender. There's all these things where there's economic privilege, right, which people can have. So white privilege is the when you put those together, in my mind, is the privilege that we get as people who identify as white in a society because that society's constructs that we may not even, many of us may not even realize, that we're getting, right? It's built into the systems. It's built into, and we'll get into more detail later, I'm sure, like the different levels of where privilege shows up. But it's the fact that because of the appearance of our skin, that in our culture and our society, that we get certain advantages over over other folks who don't look like us.
Mm-hmm. So that's at least a baseline we can use in this conversation to have some understanding in that regard. There's another word that you use in your work, called, and especially in the workshops that you and Ra do, is rehumanization. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, one of the things that's powerful for me is that anytime we type rehumanization, spell check wants to correct it to dehumanization, which is very fascinating to me. Okay, the word rehumanization doesn't really. I'm not saying we're the first ones to use it, but it doesn't. It's not like commonly accepted apparently, because and so our fundamental premise, and this is a very deep concept. It's hard to but I'll give it. Is that the systems that hold racism, right, and privilege and inequity in place are dehumanizing to everybody. And I need to say up front, I am not making any false comparisons, comparative. I mean, folks of color, obviously we don't deal as white people anywhere near the things that folks of color deal with in terms of the oppressive systems and the nature and everything that happens. But fundamentally, if you understand, at least on the level that we work on, which is the level of humanity or consciousness or interconnectedness, okay, which we believe is fundamentally a human thing, then when you create anything that causes a disconnect to people, even for the people who are privileged by it, okay, there's a dehumanizing impact of it, because again, you have to accept the premise that I believe that we're all fundamentally, intended to be connected. We're one, and if you look at by the way, back to any kind of spiritual religious tradition, they'll say it in every way, whether it's Eastern philosophy saying we're one consciousness, whether it's love thy neighbor, whether it's, so for me, it's at that level that we've all been dehumanized. Obviously, there's been bigger impact on different groups, but I believe we can rebuild a system, a construct, an economy, politics, all of that stuff in a way that is rehumanizing to everybody, as opposed to dehumanizing it in different ways and different levels to everybody.
Well, and certainly, this about me personally. When we met before any of this happened, my business is called Ubuntu Global, and Ubuntu means I am because we are because I am, which is exactly to your point, is that not only are we all connected, but when any one of us, particularly as you look at it as a group, and when any particular group is dehumanized in some way, that impacts the other groups. And what comes to my mind now as we are going through this pandemic is when you look at healthcare and how inequitable it is, well, that impacts people who are privileged economically, but it impacts them in a way where it costs more. If things were more equitable, then healthcare wouldn't cost so much in the first place, because you wouldn't be spending so much money on people when they go to the emergency room for their regular healthcare, because they have to wait until the last minute, which is worse, and it goes on and on. It ends up being a dehumanizing system in so many ways. So makes a lot of sense. At least it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, no question about it. And, one of the ways we often say it, which is totally consistent with everything you just said, is that, I truly believe that my liberation as a human being is dependent upon your liberation.
Mm.
Like, as long as anybody is not liberated, as long as somebody is oppressed, okay, we all cannot be fully liberated as humans.
And that's a process, that's a journey for all of us to go through. It's not like you pop a pill and all of a sudden you understand that. You have to do your own work, right, to get to that point. And it's a lot of work.
No question. I've been doing this work for 25 years. I met my wife. A lot of people assume, because my wife happens to be African American, a lot of people assume I started this work when I met her. It was the other way around. I got inspired to do this work. We met through the work. But the only reason I raise that is because I have been 20 years now in an interracial relationship. I spent a lot of time in different communities of color and, all different communities. And yeah, I mean, have I learned a lot? Have I come a long way? But I'm still learning stuff every day that's new, not only in terms of information, but in terms of understanding the entrenched paradigms, okay, and how they impact me, no matter how long I've been doing this work. So I always say to people, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. We've got lots of questions, so we're going to get to the next one. The next question is, how do you respond to poor and uneducated or underemployed white people who don't feel privileged and disagree with the concept?
Yeah. So there's two main things I want to say here. One is, and listen, people have different views on this and I respect them. One is, I believe that you have to meet people where they are. Doesn't mean you accept where they are. Doesn't mean that you don't have a strong intention to move them. Doesn't mean that you're going to buy into white fragility and not, but it means that as an access point, right? If you are, I'll often say to my activist friends, although, listen, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? Right? And frankly, a lot of people want to be right. Right. And there are times when I want to be right. I'm not, I don't want to just put on other people. Right. But ultimately, I always try to come back to my commitment is to be effective. Okay. So if I want to be effective, I need to meet people where they are. And then, yes, have a strong, desire and intention to move them and not let them sit there. So the reason I raise that is because, if you approach somebody like that and say, oh, you're privileged because you're white skin, whatever, then especially, somebody who's born up, let's say was born, white, poor, let's go to extreme, trailer park, like whatever the stereotype you want to put on them. Trust me, they do not live their lives thinking they're privileged. And in many ways, they're not.
Right.
So my first suggestion would be to acknowledge that. Okay. That's an access point. You can say, if you happen to know this about them and they say to you, listen, I'm not privileged. I grew up dirt poor. We didn't, we barely had a home, or I was homeless, or whatever it was. You can acknowledge that. You can say, yeah, I get that. And I appreciate that. You did not have economic privilege. Right. So now we've connected with them, and that's accurate. And now we can say, however, let's talk about the different types of privilege, right? We all have in some ways some versus other. I mean, there are folks of color, right? Let's say Black folks who, had economic privilege, right? Who were brought up, right? They don't have skin color privilege. If they're female, they don't have gender privilege, but maybe they were raised in a wealthy family. Well, they had some economic privilege, right? So one, meeting them where they are and acknowledging where they legitimately feel they're not privileged. Two, then the second big thing is what I alluded to before, is starting to make the distinction of the different types of privilege, and then the conversation of how some of us have some of us have the other. And then obviously the next step is then to delve more deeply into white privilege and the ways it shows up. But if you don't do those first two things, because if you're talking at people, right, if you don't connect with them and they won't hear you, and then you don't make the distinction that we're not talking about, we acknowledge the ways you're not privileged, but this is a way you are privileged, then you can't even get to the deeper discussion on white privilege.
Well, and so often, because I'm sure you get this question too, people are always asking how, in fact, one of the questions that's going to relate to this is, how do I even get into this conversation when I know somebody sees things so differently? The challenge that most people have is they want to jump into the conversation and change that person immediately. So they're on a wrong premise. They're already presuming they are right. and they're right in their mind. Of course, the other person is right in their mind. And if you start that way, to your point, it's going to be a defensive, it's not even going to be a conversation, really. It's just going to be a boxing match, so to speak, hopefully just verbally. So finding that common ground, some context in which you can agree before you then move further into what your perspective is, what your worldview is so important. But that's not the way most people communicate, especially when they're communicating with someone they know sees things very differently. And we're just not going to get very far if all we're doing is arguing all the time, because those defenses will definitely be up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No
Go
question.
ahead.
No question. I was just going to say, one of the things that sort of inspires me, because it's a place that I certainly have not gone, nor do I have a desire to go. I look at some folks. I've got a friend of Barron who's done it with one person. There are people. And I'll recall his name in a moment. Who've actually worked with like Ku Klux Klan, skinhead, white supremacist folks, right, and have had hundreds of them leave those movements, right? So in my mind, I'm like, boy, the level of respect I have, because no matter how much work I've done, I have not gone into Ku Klux Klan and tried to convert those folks. My point is, though, the fact that that's possible, right, that we see that happen with people on those extremes, means to me that, that you could deal with Uncle Bob at Thanksgiving, right? You just got to do it in the right way, because people have, converted people who are even more extreme.
Absolutely. So,
Daryl Davis, sorry, I wanted to.
Daryl Davis, you knew it was going to come.
Yeah.
It's going to come to you. Do you believe the term white privilege is a term for Blacks to make excuses for their social and economic well-being?
Wow. Okay. No, is the short answer. So, all right, I believe people who make that argument are, first of all, don't understand, haven't really studied all the way that privilege, exists in this world. So it's a way to try to move the focus, right, from here to over there. Now, I will say there's the only thing that has some thread of, of something that, that's true in there, but we can't use it as a sword, is that when you look at the conversation of oppression, right, and these systems, there's a thing, that a resource that we really have a lot of respect for, called the Four Eyes of Oppression. And the Four Eyes of Oppression, which was popularized by the Chinook Fund, and you can just Google it, and there's a lot of free material on it, has that oppression is on an ideological level, an institutional level, an interpersonal level, and then also an internalized level, right? So there is work that, there are certainly, I'm sure, Lenora, you can speak to this. There's certainly folks of color who can speak to this more from a personal experience, because I don't have it. But, people who do work in this area acknowledge that one of the things that these systems have created is internalized oppression in some cases, right, within communities of color, right? And there's we could spend hours on that conversation, right? So there is a legitimate conversation over there. The problem with some of the people who they're not really making that comment, but they're just trying to push it on. It's all about, effectively the internalization, and they don't talk about the institutionalization, the ideologies, the interpersonal. And then we actually have taken the liberty, Ron and I, of wrapping another eye around this amazing work, which we call indoctrination, right? So in other words, these four eyes, the reason they've been held in place is because there are ways through messaging and media and systems and, and education in which these concepts have been indoctrinated, into our society, and various of us has bought into them in various ways, including some people of color, but that's not, that's the work for folks of color to do. Us, white folks, we have all this other stuff we should be focusing on, as opposed to saying, look over there.
And there are people, certainly many people, who do exactly that work. I was just looking, a woman whose first name is Jennifer, last name I can't recall right now, but was watching part of her story on YouTube this morning. And she was talking about taking her son on a bus ride for the first time for him. And he was 11. This was several years ago. And he got on the bus, and she's Black. Her son is Black. And her son saw another Black man on the bus. Everybody else was white. And her son said, he looks just like Daddy. And she was stunned by that, because she's like, all Black people don't look alike. And I'm going to have a conversation with him. And then her son said, I hope he's not going to rob us. Now, I share this with you because that's absolutely an example of that internalized oppression. When you keep seeing the same pictures, hearing the same stories all the time, whether you're white and you believe it, and you can be Black and believe it, and especially as a child who hasn't yet had enough conversation with people to help them understand how they can see things differently, but it is very, very deep. Yeah. So, and I'm not going to remember her last name like you remembered Derek. So sorry about that. So the next question, and this kind of relates to what you were just talking about, is how does white privilege differ from majority privilege? For centuries, women were the victims of systemic gender discrimination.
Yeah. So no question that second part of that statement is true, right? The statement part is true. So again, the first thing is we need to understand that there are these multiple ways in which we could either be privileged or oppressed, or a lack of privilege, right? And one of the things that is important, and often when those questions are raised, right? So I'll give you an example. A lot of times, this is when we've done work, I've been in other people's work or whatever, right? Where we're focusing on race, okay? You and I actually have been in meetings where this conversation has come up. People bring these other, right, oppressions, and privileges up. And while it's an appropriate conversation, there's an appropriate conversation in terms of intersectionality and how all that comes together. It's often brought up as a way not to keep the focus, right? Mm-hmm. And it's important to keep the focus on, by the way, whichever area you're doing, right? Number one. Number two, I believe, right? And again, I don't want, I hesitate in saying this because one of the ways that we are kept separated is comparative oppression. Mm-hmm. And I really think we need to avoid that. Having said that, I do believe that there's something different in this particular country, especially about race, because I look at it as an original sin, right? I look at slavery, right? And not that women weren't oppressed, not that, right? But enslaved in that, in that way, and everything that's come out of that, African-American folks have a very unique history in this country. What's more important to say, however, though, is the point I alluded to before. I believe that one of the ways that these systems have been kept in place, and one of the ways that the powers that be throughout history, and not only in this country, is that they take people who have so much more in common and use things like race, and, yes, and gender, and immigration status, and these other things, right, to keep us divided. And the main reason they do that is because, frankly, they're afraid of what happens if we come together. I mean, this sounds kind of stupid, but I think if anybody has seen the Saturday Night Live bit, Black Jeopardy with oh my God, Forrest Gump, what's his name?
Tom Hanks.
Thanks, with Tom Hanks, right? Tom Hanks plays he's wearing a MAGA hat. Plays a conservative Trump reporter, and of course the Black Jeopardy thing is very overplayed in terms of the characterizations of Black folks or whatever, purposely to. And the whole thing about is they ask these questions about views of the government and all this stuff, and it ends up that he and the Black folks actually have very similar views on some issues. They come at it from a different point of view. And the reason why I'm citing that sort of stupid example is, for me, it's profound because I fundamentally believe that a lot of the folks, right, who let's say white folks on the right, that there's so much more in common that they have with there's ways it's definitely different, but there's so much more in common they have in terms of the economic oppression, at least. Mm-hmm. But the question is, why are those groups? The more important question is, why are those groups so adverse? And I think that's by design, right? Mm-hmm. By using race to keep. Listen, if you go back to indentured servitude, when we had white and Black indentured servitudes, there was a time when those communities was starting to see their aligned interests. All right. And the whole, if you study the slavery trade and the difference between one of the things that happened there, it was an attempt to give white folks some status, right, over enslaved black folks, right, because even as an indentured, so and that was done to have those groups not align. So it's been happening forever. So I think it's important that we understand the reasons why we're divided. Yes, we should work together on intersectionality, but too often those conversations come up as a way to say, hey, well, yeah, but what about women? Yeah, we should be dealing with all of it, right? We don't need to pick and choose, right? We don't need to, to choose whose oppression is worse than others. We should be working for a rehumanized system that, has all people be respected and have opportunity.
Yeah, too often I think people want to compare and say, well, my hurt is worse than your hurt. Well, they both hurt. So look at them both, not compare to determine which one is worse. The next question has to do with women, but there was a second part to it that you just answered. I'm going to ask it just so that the person who put it in knows that we have it. The question is, so what about women? Can we as women suffer from white privilege too? And the second part of the question, though, is, do you think white privilege is a generational thing? I think you answered it by saying how long this has been an issue.
So, I mean, on the first, listen, clearly white women, can suffer from white privilege because, again, they may not have gender privilege, but they do have white privilege. And listen, frankly, there have been, if you study a lot of the women's movement, there's definitely been tensions, in a lot of the feminist movement in terms of it being led mainly by white folks and having some, insensitivity to the different circumstances and the different, needs and values of folks of color. So there's no question that those are two different conversations. In terms of the generational thing, listen, let me sort of say that in two ways. I mean, one, yes, I mean, this is not solved with young folks. When Barack Obama became president, we were supposed to post-racial time. Any of us who does this work knew that was ridiculous, and obviously that's been proven, very clearly since then. Because what I'm encouraged by, right, is that young folks, because of the interconnectedness, right, technology, things like that, also because of just demographics, right, because the country. Now, I mean, for several years now, the majority of babies being born are non-white, okay? By, it keeps going down. They used to say 2060, 2050, 2043, by 2030 something, my guess is, right, this country is going to be a majority non-white. There's much more mixed race and, biracial and mixed race, folks. So I think between demographics and deeper connectivity and more, frankly, social consciousness among the younger generation, I have some cautious optimism, encouragement that things are, going to accelerate in the right direction. Having said that, if we understand the fact that it's not just, yes, I think all change ultimately comes from the ground, but what we're fighting against and what they're fighting against is so entrenched, so institutionalized, so deep in the paradigm and the fabric of our economic system and society and politics, whatever, that there's a huge body of work to be done. That's what sort of counterbalances my, not that, I mean, it does discourage me at times, but overall, I stay optimistic. But what it says to me is not that we don't have an evolution in a positive direction. I think young folks are going to lead, but that it will be a marathon for them as well, in terms of dismantling hundreds and hundreds of years of what's been put in place.
Just, and when I think back to the Cheerios commercial of a few years ago, when it was a black and white couple and the black daughter poured the white daughter poured the Cheerios on her black father, and the uproar that happened in social media, which was negative, it gave me hope when I saw so many other businesses intentionally have mixed race couples. And now it's the norm. I mean, you see a commercial and it's two white people or two black people. It's almost odd because there are so many. And so there's progress in that regard, but there's so much more to do. But those things are important. because those are the images that people see, and it normalizes it instead of
No
constantly
question.
being seen as
Representation
something
matters.
wrong. Absolutely.
Representation matters.
So next question. What is at its core to dismantle relative to white privilege? How do you get white people to see what they haven't experienced?
Yeah, that's a big question.
I know
Right?
that would take an hour on its own, but
So let me, I'm going to answer it in a different way, and then I'll hit it directly. Because one of the things that we deal with, you know, in the white awakening work, especially that we started after, you know, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and that kind of stuff, because there was this new awakening, it seemed, of more white folks who, you know, for a lot of folks of color I know, they were like, well, why is this one different, right? You know, we've had Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Philando Castillo, and like, you know, we go on. But there was something that was different about it, you know, and I saw it as an opportunity. You know, I'm somebody who studied the civil rights movement a lot, and I know, like, there was a time with the hoses and the dogs and the four little girls in the church bombing where white America finally started saying enough's enough, right? And that combined with the decade, you know, the work that Black people, you know, and other folks of color have been doing forever, caused some things to start tipping, right? And I saw the opportunity with George Floyd and the awakening of more folks to do that. I'm sorry, I lost the question. Bring it back to me.
so it's how do you get white people to see what they haven't experienced? How do you get them to understand this concept of white privilege when
Right,
they
and then
haven't?
how does it? Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
right. So what the question we got? The reason I raised it is so we get a lot of questions with, you know, from folks who even are like, they on a visceral level, they know this, there was something wrong with, you know, George Floyd. They may have an understanding of or starting to see, you know, things around police brutality and things like that. But what they don't have, and this is, I think, goes to the answer to the question of what you need, is you got to get a deeper understanding. So we work in 3 areas: knowledge, mindset, and behavior, right? Getting the knowledge is important, right? You can't stop there. But the problem is, until you really understand history and some of these systems and why they're entrenched or whatever, then what action do you even take, right? And then how effective are you going to be? Because when somebody gives you some, you know, counter, you know, argument, and you don't know your stuff, you know, you get stopped, right? Now, listen, I don't want to say you got to go study for 20 years, like, you know, you got to also get on the court. But the point is, there's some fundamental, you know, things to do the work. And then when you start getting that knowledge, then you can say to yourself, okay, when I combine that deeper understanding, and then who I am and what my particular talents are, right? We can't take it all on. Okay, we can't take it all on. All right, people say to me, you know, well, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this. Well, I know I could do 1,000 things, but what I do is my Conversations About Race project, White Awakening, you know, with Ra, right? We do some things in our personal lives where we just bring people together. Like, we have certain ways that we do it. Is the stuff we're doing going to transform everything? Absolutely not. Right? Are there things other people do that we don't do that should be done? Absolutely. What it's going to take is each of us in our gifts, you know, where our passions are, to do what we can make an impact on, and that cumulative effect is, you know, is what will have things change. So for me, I think it's important when, you know, to do that, to decide where you want to make an impact, and then to determine that, because people say, you know, I think people get they get stopped because they get confused, because it's so huge and it's so, you know, there's so many things you can do and you can't do, and then they're worried about saying the wrong thing or whatever. You know, I'm like, listen, you know, figure out where your passion is, right? Like, you know, Ron and I put together an online course. We knew we could do that well. We would make a difference there. We don't do DEI consulting in companies, right? Like you and other people we know do, right? That's not our work. But that is part of your work, right? So I think we need to just take on what we have to take on, where we can move the needle. You know, what do they call it? Like, take, you know, how do you eat an elephant, but one bite at a time? Like, that really applies.
Okay, that answered the next question. So I'm going to move to the next one, which is, how do we allow space to heal this inequality? Let me say it the way they wrote it. How do we allow space to heal this inequality and open brotherhood with fellow white people?
Mm. So this is one of the things that motivate me to start the conversations about Race Project 20 years ago, because that experience I had in traveling the world and spending time in, Ghana, Uganda, India, that kind of stuff, and then just sort of, looking and understanding is, it's so much harder to have, prejudice or, discriminatory views about somebody that you've met
Mm-hmm.
and have spent time with that you haven't. And if you look at how many people have strong views about different groups and they really have never, one of the questions I'll ask somebody if they say something to me, a white person, I'll say, how much time have you spent with, like not accusatory, because that could easily come across like, how much time, but because I know in my personal life, listen, I grew up in Canarsie, Brooklyn. It was a very prejudiced neighborhood. It was half Jewish, half Italian. It was in the 60s and 70s. It was when busing, forced, busing came in. And in my junior high school, they were busing the black kids in. And my neighborhood boycotted the schools. White parents came around with bullhorns telling people to keep their kids home because they were busing in the black kids. Okay. This is what I was raised with. Now, fortunately, my parents, who were not activists, who were just trying to make a living, low middle class folks, they told me they were sending me to school because they believed in education. They didn't believe in that. And I was one of 3 or 45 kids in my homeroom class. So, but that's the environment I grew up in, right? And an environment where the N-word was a regular, thing, all that stuff, right? So I have a personal journey, right? I mean, not at the extreme that some folks are, have grown up in, like, where they have, racist parents and whatever. But I have had a journey, right, from where I was, to where, where I've come. So, I think that one part of that journey that's crucially important is to try to connect. And the conversation about Race Project has people have one-on-one cross-cultural dialogues about race. We did it at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, and had Black South Africans and white South Africans talking to each other about work we've done in the community groups and schools and that kind of stuff. And the reason why, I mean, I have one story that always makes me come to tears, is that when people spend more, I know that this is not going to solve everything, right? But if we can get people, there's a reason why I bring people in my life of diverse communities together. Okay, my wife and I used to have a house on a lake in New York, and we would, and you know how most people have their like their college friends come one weekend, and they get together with their work friends or their whatever. We would put out 4 weekends a year that we were opening the house for gathering, and whoever signed up signed up. We had conservative investment bankers with radical, left peace activists, with musicians, with whatever. People who would never be in the same room together. And you know what? Every single time it was amazing. Connections were made in a way that never would have been made before. I do admit I usually had a decent amount of red wine flowing to help, but my point is that I think the first point is to try to find ways for people to get to know each other. It's not, there's all kinds of work to do beyond that because of the institutional and whatever, but we've seen it with, I know I want to stop because there's a lot of other questions, but you've seen it with folks who have been anti-gay, for example, and they find out their kid is gay, right? And how it changes them. Like, opportunity to know somebody who has a different experience, is a starting point.
Yeah. Well, and certainly from what when I say we, I mean all of us who do this work and people who are learning, what we now know about the neuroscience and bias is it's easy to keep believing the stereotypes and the biases that are in your head when you have no relationship with someone who is different. So in this case, Black person, white person, if the only way you see them is on TV, and for Black people, if the only way you see them is in stereotypical negative roles, then you're going to see them like the little boy that I referred to that Jennifer was talking about, her son, because that's all you know. But when you meet a real person who happens to be of that group that you have all these stereotypes about, first of all your stereotypes come to fore, and then you realize, oh, that's all that it was. because this is a real person, it's an individual, and it's really hard to keep that stereotype when you meet more people who are different than you in that way, because now you're seeing them as human beings. And why is that so hard? But it is, it seems to be. So I've been asking you lots of questions that people sent in ahead of time. I'm going to reach out to Jen to let us know if there are any questions in the queue and to have her ask you a question. Jen,
We do
got
have
anything?
several questions. Yep, we do have several coming in. So the first question is, how can we as white privileged people show support and concern without appearing condescending?
So there's a lot of ways I could answer that, and I'll answer that along with a related question of there's been this tension between white people getting involved, but also not drowning out Black voices, right, or not taking the lead or not stepping over, right. It relates to the conversation of condescending. So my first point is I believe that there's more than enough work to do, right? That we don't need to, there's a space for all of us. Let me just say that, right? We need all of us. There's a space for all of us. Yes, I do believe as white folks. So let me just make a comment on privilege. Privilege in general, one of the things that often happens with privilege in general is that without realizing it, we take up space, okay, in a way where, it's just what we used to, right? We've always sort of had that right to take up space. So I think there's a sensitivity that as people in a majority of anything, whether it's race, gender, et cetera, that we need to have that. And we do definitely need to make sure we provide space and voices and, and whatever, I mean, like even right now, I'm being interviewed, so I'm doing most of the talking, and that's the appropriate place for this format. But there's still part of me that says, I'm just one person. It's my experience. I don't want to come across like I know everything, or So there's a sensitivity, to that to provide space for other folks. The other thing I would say is that there's so much work, and again, it goes back to my comment of do what you're drawn to do. So there's definitely intercultural, interracial work that needs to be done. But I'll tell you, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and it's the place where there's much less of it being done for white folks with other white folks. Okay, so one of the places I would encourage a lot of folks to look, all right, is to say, hey, how can we do work in our own community, right? And again, when I keep saying white folks, I want to make sure I'm talking about, I'm not going to repeat it every time. It's people identify about white, because what race is social constructs, it doesn't exist in biology. Take a look at the Human Genome Project and many other things. So let's just make sure we understand that we're talking about a fiction that we all have bought into, but that has significant consequences in our society. So I would say, a lot of these challenges go away about stepping over, if we're doing work in the white community, right? I mean, in terms of, but then if you're going to do intercultural work, yeah, I mean, it takes practice, and it takes being in the environment, and it takes a willingness to actually overstep and take input from folks of color, when you have, in a way that balances you bringing your voice and your unique contribution, and we need it from everybody, with you either dominating a space or, and the last thing I'll say, especially because there are other forces like media and things like that may be more inclined to come to you than to other folks. So there's an opportunity to highlight, to use your privilege, right? To use your privilege to make opportunities, to highlight, to cite, to respect, to, it's why it was so important to me earlier in the call for me to remember Daryl Davis's name. He's an African-American guy, right? So that's just a little example for me. It was important for me to remember his name because I needed to credit him for that work that inspired me as a person in general. I believe to give him credit, but also as an African-American guy who's had hundreds of Ku Klux Klan and other people give him their robes. I mean, come on.
So certainly what we have taken away so far is, because there is so much work to do, there are lots of different ways to do it. And it doesn't necessarily mean if you're white, that as a white person, you have to be matched up with a Black person. There's a lot of work you can do when Black people are not present, so that you can speak to or speak up when other white people are making stereotypical comments, or they're saying things that are not factual, that kind of thing. That's another way to be supportive. And there's lots more questions about different ways to be an ally, especially in the workplace. So before I get to those, though, I want to make sure that we honor those questions that have come in. Jen, do you have any more?
Oh, I do actually. One that came in is a question about the fact that white privilege is sometimes comes unearned. Can you make any comment on that?
Yeah, I would actually say it's not sometimes comes unearned, it's always unearned, right? I mean, because we're born with skin that is identified as white. The minute that happens, because of the paradigm we're in society, we have privilege. So it's always unearned, right? Any inherent characteristic for which you get privilege on is unearned, right? And I think that's important, right? To understand, not just to make that statement that it's always unearned, but to understand that we get advantage. So let me go back. There are some folks who say, "Hey, I don't have privilege. I worked hard for everything that I created," right? And normally that's in a conversation of feeling like you don't have economic privilege, right? Where you worked hard, you worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever, or you grew up poor and became successful, right? And yes, you should be, again, meeting people there. You should be honored for that, right? For your hard work, for getting past that economic lack of privilege. But economics is something, yes, you're born into, but it's not an inherent characteristic, right? It's changeable, right? Skin color is not changeable, right? So the advantages we get from that are what they are. And I think the work is then to understand the paradigm that creates that, right? And then the final thing I'll say about this is this, and this is a journey of internal work, because those of us who identify white or Black, right, or Asian or Latino or whatever it is, Native American, it's part of our identity, right? And sometimes white folks feel like when the conversation of white privilege comes up is that we're saying that there's something wrong with who you are, right? And I think it's a tough body of work to say, listen, I identify white, I identify Jewish, at least culturally, right? There's a lot of ways I identify. I identify male, I identify as a New Yorker, right? So, and those are all part of who I am, and I like myself, right? So I don't want to, I'm not looking to not be white, quote unquote, right? It's part of who I am. What I'm looking to do is look at the places where my whiteness, right, has impact in the world in a way, or whether it's through privilege or whether it's through my unconscious, or implicit bias, which impacts other people. It doesn't serve my commitment to what I want to see in the world, right? Doesn't mean that I should not be white or I should be embarrassed about being white, right? My skin is my skin. It's part of who I am, right? We should love ourselves, but also be able to separately look at the impact that the concept of whiteness, that the privilege we get in society gives us, and keep our identity, but reject those things that are, don't create the world we want to see.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a few more of the questions, looking at time, that I have, and we'll go back to Jen if we have the time to see if there's more questions. And these questions, because so many came in about what to do in the workplace. So these are now all related to the workplace in one way or another. One is, how can white privilege be successfully managed in the workplace?
Wow. That one managed is interesting. So listen, let me say, and this is one of the reasons why I have a huge amount of respect for people who do DEI work in companies. If you don't have buy-in at the highest levels, at a transformational, entity, organizational wide level, maybe you'll make some incremental progress, but you're not going to have transformation, right?
Mhm.
So I don't want to be discouraging, but if you are working in a place where you don't have, are not in the, in the decision-making process where you can affect the highest level decisions and the, and the commitment to this work really, then, the best you can do is try to influence those to do that if you really want organizational change. Having said that, at the same time, though, there are things that you can do on an interpersonal basis, on a, on in your group basis, whatever it is, to make progress. And and they relate to some of the things that we talked about before, right? Having real, one of the reasons why and I'm not, by the way, promoting this. We hardly ever do the Conversation About Race project anymore. We're much more focused on white awakening and stuff. But one of the things that Conversation About Race was so, the reason I started that is because when Bill Bradley was running for president in 2000, I saw him make a statement. The paraphrase is, if you haven't had a conversation about race with a person of another race, you're part of the problem. And that really inspired me. First of all, I said, that's a bold statement for a presidential candidate, especially back in 2000. And I realized I traveled in some diverse circles. I was active in the Hunger Project at that part, but I said, have we ever had really, do I really have one-on-one, like authentic, open, true conversations about race with people? We talk about the issues around race. We talk about crime and inner-city kids and discrimination and affirmative action, whatever. And I had friends that I talked about some other very intimate topics with, whether it's our family life, our sex lives, our money, or whatever. But how many times did we really talk about what was it like for me growing up? What was it like for you growing up? What I always want to know about you. And that was the inspiration for that project. So in your individual, so on the interpersonal level, right, being willing to have those authentic, dialogues, to create environments where you can build relationship, can make a difference on the interpersonal level. It's just that on the institutional organizational level, the best you can try to do is influence the powers that be, to buy in, because it's going to be tough to change things on that level unless you have that.
Mm-hmm. And given the work that I do, and especially the work that I do with executives, the unfortunate murder of George Floyd caused many executives, most of whom are white, most of whom are male, to recognize something is really not wrong. I mean, really not correct. And it challenged their values. And so what gives me hope is, although the guys in the C-suite are struggling with their white privilege, trying to understand what it is, trying to figure out how can they lead as an inclusive leader, what does that look like? They're struggling with it. At least now they are. At least now they really are wanting to know, where before it's like somebody else's problem. At least it seemed to be, especially as it relates to why the diversity needle didn't move much, because we never really went deeper. And now that everyone has kind of experienced the same thing by seeing that video and recognizing this is not the world I want to be in, they're more committed and some are more willing to be vulnerable with their employees, because employees think the leaders know everything, and they clearly don't, and they certainly clearly don't in this regard, because it is a marathon. So it's being willing to have those conversations and having the leaders be willing to have the conversations and learn, etc. So there are some organizations out there that are wrestling with this now and trying to figure out what will best work. But it's a process for sure.
Yeah.
So we'll piggyback on leadership. How do you address this with your leadership in a lunch and learn or some type of session?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of the challenges, right? And I think, Lenora, you can even speak this much more than I can, because you do this in corporations all the time. But let me just say, one of the challenges that people think you can address this in a lunch and learn, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'd rather have somebody do a lunch and learn than not do a lunch and learn,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the folks that I know that are really committed to making a difference in in this work will probably, and again, I'm going to turn this one back to you, Lenora. Will most often say to people, sure, we can talk about a lunch and learn, but if you're really committed to making any change, right? We need to do these 5 other things, or,
Mhm.
right, we need, I need to meet with your executive, with your board, with your executive team, then, before we're all, so, I'm going to put it back to you. I don't want to like avoid the question. There's a lot you can
Mhm.
do in a lunch and learn that will, make
Mhm.
some difference, but I think the more important point is to say a lunch and learn, that's like, you gotta do
Well,
more.
the challenge, at least I agree with you if the choice is do nothing or have a lunch and learn, then yes, have a lunch and learn, and then you can at least have a conversation. The problem is that we've been stuck at either saying nothing or having a conversation and doing nothing afterwards. So awareness is critical, but it needs to be awareness with accountability. With me, there's something that's going to follow. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understanding white privilege. There are no cliff notes for this. You
No,
have to do the work. There's
no.
no shortcut, and sometimes the work can be painful. I can't believe how the time is flying. I'm going to ask you two. Let's see. I've got so many. Um, everyone is always saying how to be an ally, asking how to be an ally, and I think in your answers to various other questions, you've addressed that. Figure out what your passion is and the best way for you to speak up speak up for people not in the room and that type of thing. So I'm going to ask you this question, and then we'll share some other things and bring this to a close. The question is, how do I make white privilege actionable for the betterment of society?
Wow, big question. Um, I'm actually going to tie it into the ally conversation in one way, because we actually believe, we talk about beyond allyship often, and one of the problems with the conversation of ally is that it's such a broad term, we don't even know what it means. If you put a supportive Facebook post, are you an ally? Some people think, yeah, I'm an ally. I said George Floyd's murder was bad, right? Do you have to march, do you have to march, on the streets? Do you have to, so we actually have in the White Awakening work, we have a 9 archetype spectrum that takes people all the way from hostile adversary all the way through some categories to, bystanders and early ally and seasoned ally and partner and one advocate, partner one. And the reason we do that, and the only reason I'm raising that, is because it relates to this question of what action you can take. The actions are different depending upon what stage you're at. Okay. Because if you are moving from being, let's say, what we call a conscious bystander, right? Which is somebody who says, oh, that's terrible that George Floyd, this happened. I really think that's bad. But you've been a bystander. You haven't really done much about it. Like there's something that affects you, right? Then the question is, what do you need to do to move to early ally? And that might include probably a lot of work on learning, on knowledge, focusing on the knowledge piece. Because if you've been a bystander, there's a lot you don't know. So if you go run out and, yeah, I mean, sure, if you want to attend the protest, go do it. If you want to post on Facebook, but if you want to be effective, the body of work and moving from an unconscious bystander or a conscious bystander to an early ally is a lot involved in learning some stuff, right? If you are a seasoned ally and you've been doing the work for a long time and you've been out there, right, and you move to what our next category, is called, is advocate, right? Then, you're often moving from, there's a few different ways, but one of the questions we ask with folks that have been doing the work for a while is, okay, or certainly from early ally to seasoned ally, and then even more so when we go next, is, okay, what have you been willing to put at risk, right? Because there's one thing to be, I'm down for the cause, right? But we talk about this in the speaker community, right? I'll ask speakers who say they're down for the cause. I'll say, okay, have you, just as an example, I'm curious, if you want to know what you can do, have you, when you are booked to speak at a conference or on a panel, do you look at who else is on the panel and the racial makeup and gender makeup and other, of that panel? Some people will say no. Okay, well, that's something you can do. Oh yeah, I do look. Well, okay, do you do anything about it? Well, no, it bothers me. Okay, well, that's the next step. You can maybe reach out to the organizer and say, hey, listen, I noticed the panel looks heavily, white male. Maybe can I recommend to you some, more diverse speakers? Or are you willing to go to the level, which, I know folks, including me, who have done, where unless there's a certain level of diversity, depending upon what the thing is and whatever, that you won't speak unless there's, right? So the reason I raised it as an example is that I think it's important to understand where you are if you want your action to be effective, right? And you are, a conscious bystander, early ally. If you go to jump all the way over, it's not going to be effective. So I think you got to find where you are and then look at what the next action is. And you can speak to folks like us who've done it. And what I find is that, especially for white folks, it's not folks of color's job to educate us. All right. And we should have no expectation of that. Having said that, the more work you're willing to do, and if they
Just
see you're
froze.
there,
Hopefully he'll unfreeze in a minute, but I know what he was going to say is it's not, yeah, you froze for a second there.
okay.
Corey. It's not white folks. It's not Black folks' job to educate white folks, I think is what you were going to say, right?
Correct. And also I found that the more work we're willing to do and they see we're willing to do and we're there consistently and we're taking those actions, then the more they're willing to contribute to us because, so yeah, I think you got to find out where you are first and then identify the next right action for you that will make a difference.
Absolutely. So in closing, oh, thank you so much. How do people get in touch with you if they want to reach you or they want to follow you? And while you're answering that question, Jen will put in the chat a link to your assessment.
Great.
That is free.
So that's a free assessment that will let you know where you are on those 9 archetypes to be able to figure out what you do next. So a lot of the work that we do on White Awakening is all over at movethecrowd.me, which is my wife's company that we house it over there. So you can get all that stuff. If you want to find out about me generally, it's CoreyKupfer.com, my full name.com. And on all social media, I'm at Corey Kupfer at, all LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and Clubhouse now and all that stuff.
Yes, trying to get in Clubhouse as well. So again, Corey, this has been fabulous. I know there are more questions. I hope that this has generated some energy for people to continue this conversation with their colleagues, whatever color they are, to go deeper. And so again, thank you so much. You're so busy that I was just thrilled that we were able to have time, and how appropriate that we're talking about white privilege during Black History Month. So again, thank you. Next month, mark your calendar for 3 o'clock on March 18th. And we're going to be addressing everything about LGBTQIA+. And it's going to be with the expert Lisa Kopecki. So please tune in again. You'll get the links to the recording if you registered via Zoom, and we'll send out lots of information if you didn't register that way so that you can the next time. Thanks so much, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.